He slid the divorce papers across the marble table without looking up from his phone. No explanation, no apology, not even the basic decency of meeting her eyes. Amara Brooks had walked into her own home expecting champagne and candlelight. 8 years, and she still believed in that man. Instead, she found another woman wearing her silk robe, sitting on the edge of her bed like she belonged there. And when Amara stood frozen in the doorway, her anniversary gift still in her hand, Kang Min-jae finally looked up. Not with shame, not with guilt, with irritation. Like she was the inconvenience. If that were you, if the person you sacrificed everything for looked at you like you were a problem to be solved, what would you do? If this story already has your heart pounding, you're exactly where you need to be. Hit that like button, drop your city or country in the comments below so I can see how far this story has traveled, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Because what Amara does next will either break you or set you on fire. Let's begin. The elevator doors opened at 11:47 p.m. Amara stepped into the penthouse hallway with a bottle of Bollinger under her arm and a smile she'd been rehearsing since the taxi ride from Incheon. 8 years. She'd mentally composed a small toast on the flight back from Singapore. Nothing dramatic, just something honest. Something that said, I still choose you. I still believe in what we built. The lights in the main living room were dimmed low, which she thought was romantic until she heard the sound. She stopped walking. It wasn't loud, just a laugh, low and soft, from behind the bedroom door, and it wasn't her laugh. Amara stood in the hallway for what felt like a long time. The champagne bottle was cold against her ribs. She told herself several things in rapid succession. That she was tired from the flight, that she was misreading a sound, that Min-jae sometimes had late meetings, that there was an explanation for all of this that made sense and didn't require her to open that door. She opened the door. Young Soo-yeon sat on the edge of the bed wearing Amara's ivory silk robe, the one Min-jae had given her for her birthday 3 years ago, and she looked up with the specific expression of someone who had been waiting for this moment and had rehearsed it more carefully than Amara had rehearsed her toast. Not surprise, not shame, something closer to composure. Min-jae was at the window with a glass of whiskey, still dressed in his suit jacket, like he'd been expecting an interruption and had prepared accordingly. He turned when Amara pushed the door open, and his expression did the thing it always did when something required management. It went flat. Controlled. The underworld face, Amara used to call it privately. The one that gave nothing away. "You're back early," he said. Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "This isn't what it looks like." Not a single syllable that acknowledged the woman sitting on their bed in her robe. The summit ended Thursday. Amara's voice came out steadier than she expected. "I told you that." "You said Friday." "I said Thursday. I have the message." He took a sip of whiskey. Soo-yeon hadn't moved. She was watching the exchange with a particular quality of stillness. Not uncomfortable stillness, not someone desperate for escape. Watching, the way you watch a scene you've already been briefed on. That's when it reached Amara. Not the woman, not even the robe. It was the stillness. Soo-yeon wasn't afraid of her, wasn't embarrassed, and that meant she had been told not to be, or she had been here long enough that the fear had passed. "Soo-yeon," Min-jae said, without looking at her. "Give us the room." The assistant stood without a word, moved past Amara in the doorway with her eyes forward, not avoidant, just forward, and disappeared toward the guest wing. She knew where the guest wing was. She knew this apartment. Amara felt the champagne bottle growing heavier. Min-jae crossed to the dresser, set down his glass, and opened the top drawer. He took out a manila envelope and set it on the edge of the bed where Soo-yeon had just been sitting. "I've been meaning to talk to you," he said. Amara looked at the envelope. "What is that?" "Papers. The attorney prepared everything cleanly. The division is fair, more than fair, honestly. You'll have access to accounts for the next 60 days while you locate alternate housing, and there's a settlement figure in there that I think—" "Stop talking." He stopped. "Stop talking for 1 second." She pressed her hand flat against the doorframe because her knees had gone slightly wrong. Not collapsing, just uncertain. and she needed something solid. How long? He didn't ask what she meant. How long, Minjai? He looked at her with that same flat management face and said, It doesn't matter now. It matters to me. How long? A pause that was its own answer. 3 years, he said. The champagne bottle left her hand before she decided to set it down. She must have set it down. She didn't hear it break. She registered somewhere distant that she had placed it carefully against the wall, because some part of her was still functioning on autopilot, still performing the woman who kept things elegant, who didn't cause scenes, who understood that scenes were not what people like them did. 3 years, she said. Not a question, just the words in the air. I wasn't going to do this tonight. You came back. I came back on Thursday, which is when I said I'd be back. She picked up the envelope. Her hands were steady, and she hated that her hands were steady because it meant none of the shock had arrived in her body yet. It was still somewhere behind her ribs waiting for space. She looked at the front of the envelope. Her name, in clean-typed font, Amara Brooks Kang. You had this ready. Yes. You had this ready before tonight. Amara, how long has this been ready, Minjai? The papers. Not the affair. The papers. And there it was. The first crack in the flat face. Not guilt, not remorse. Something closer to impatience, the particular impatience of a man who had planned something thoroughly and was now being required to explain it. 4 months, he said. She nodded slowly. 4 months. While she was in Singapore building his company's regional presence. While she was sitting in conference rooms in Jakarta and Kuala Lumpur and Tokyo, selling the image of Kang Min-jae's legitimate empire to people who would otherwise never have touched it. While she was away working on his future, he was here preparing her exit. Is it because you don't love me, she said, or is it because I don't fit? He was quiet for long enough that the quiet was an answer. Both, he finally said. And what made it devastating wasn't the cruelty. It was that he said it gently, like he was doing her the courtesy of not lying. The company is moving into a different phase that the people we'll be working with, politically, socially, they have expectations. Suyeon understands this world in a way that what? That I don't. You built the world I needed. You're extraordinary at what you do. But what I need now is, don't. Her voice cracked, just once, just slightly, just enough that she heard it, and so did he. Don't finish that sentence in a way that makes this about strategy. He closed his mouth. She stood there for a moment longer than she needed to. Some part of her was still waiting for something. For him to move toward her, for the face to break differently, for there to be something underneath the strategy that was human and sorry and reaching for her. She had loved this man for 11 years, married him for 8. She had sat across boardroom tables translating his criminal empire into a language the legitimate world could accept, had smoothed every rough edge of the Kang name until it shone, had built the public identity of his dynasty from raw material and intelligence in years she would not get back. She looked at him one more time. He looked back at her with the flat face. She took the envelope and walked out. She did not cry in the elevator. She was very precise about that. She stood in the mirrored box with the champagne bottle she'd somehow picked up again, watching her own reflection, and she kept her jaw locked until the lobby. The night doorman looked up when she walked through, started to say something, probably her name, probably a greeting, and she shook her head once and he understood, or he pretended to, and she walked out into the Seoul night. It was cold. Late November, and the wind had a particular quality that found every gap in your clothing. She stood on the pavement outside the building that had been her home for 4 years and she breathed. Then she called Zora. It rang twice. Amara, it's midnight. What? Can I come over? A beat. Zora had known her since Howard University, had been the maid of honor at a wedding she'd helped plan, could read the specific quality of Amara's silences the way other people read text. I'll put the kettle on, she said. Take a cab. Don't drive. Amara didn't have a car here anyway. She flagged a taxi. She sat in the back seat with the envelope in her lap and the champagne bottle beside her like a passenger, and she watched Seoul slide past the windows. The Han River briefly visible between buildings, lit bridges, the city that had been her home for almost a decade. She had come here for him. had learned enough Korean to move through business meetings without a translator, had built a professional life here from nothing because his life was here, and she had believed, with the specific faith of a woman who has not yet learned its cost, that his life and her life were the same life. The taxi driver didn't try to make conversation. Zora opened the door before she knocked. She looked at Amara's face and then at the envelope, and she didn't ask questions, just stepped back and let her in. And Amara walked into the small, warm apartment in Mapogu that smelled like ginger and someone else's laundry. And she sat down on Zora's couch, and the envelope slid to the floor, and that was when her hands started shaking. Not crying, just shaking, like her body had decided the hands were the appropriate place for everything to arrive. "He had papers," she said. Zora sat down beside her. "Papers. Prepared. 4 months ago. The attorney, the settlement, the division, all of it." She picked the envelope up off the floor and turned it over. "I walked in and she was there. In my robe. He handed me this like it was a meeting he'd been waiting to close." Zora was quiet for a moment. "Who was she?" "Suyan, his assistant." "How long?" 3 years, he said." Zora said something in a low voice that wasn't quite a word. She got up and came back with 2 mugs of tea, and she set them on the coffee table and sat close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, and she didn't reach for Amara and she didn't offer platitudes. She just sat there, solid and present, while Amara's hands shook around the mug. "Did you cry?" Zora said. "Not yet." "Okay. I don't know if I'm going to." "Also okay." Amara looked at the manila envelope on the coffee table. "He said I don't fit the next phase. That she understands the world he's moving into." She paused. "After 8 years. After Zora, I built his international presence, the Hong Kong deal, the Singapore expansion, the investor relationships in London. I wrote the brand strategy that turned his company from a name people avoided into a name people competed to work with. I did that. I know. He knows I did that. I know," Zora said again. "And he used it, and he planned your exit for 4 months while you were still doing it." She paused, "which means he knew exactly what he was throwing away. He just decided the exchange was worth it." That landed differently than anything else had, because Zora was right. This wasn't a man who'd underestimated Amara. This was a man who'd calculated her value precisely, extracted the last of what he needed, and arranged the paperwork while she was still in the building. Amara put the mug down. "I need an attorney," she said. "Yes, you do. A good one. Not someone connected to his network. Someone independent." "I know someone," Zora said. "Victoria Han. She's been eating corporate men for lunch for 15 years. She won't be intimidated by the Kang name." Amara nodded. Something was happening inside her. Not resolution exactly, not yet, because the grief was still there, still parked somewhere behind her sternum, waiting for a private moment. But underneath it, something else was waking up, something that had been asleep for a long time, something she'd put away in a drawer years ago when she decided that her ambitions were secondary to the project of building someone else's empire. She picked up the envelope. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she set it on the table face down so she didn't have to see her own name in that clean-typed font. "He's going to think I'll take the settlement and disappear," she said. Zora looked at her. "He's going to think," Amar continued, "that I'm going to be grateful for the 60 days and the separation accounts and go somewhere quiet and not make noise. And are you?" Amara thought about Min Jae's flat face, the impatience behind it, the 4 months of prepared paperwork, the way Su Yan had walked past her in the doorway with her eyes forward, unhurried, certain of her position. "I spent 8 years making him untouchable," she said quietly. "I know exactly where every vulnerability is." Zora picked up her mug. "I'll call Victoria in the morning," she said. Outside, Seoul hummed in the dark, enormous and indifferent, and Amara sat in her best friend's small apartment and felt the grief and the fury taking up adjacent space inside her chest, pressing against each other, and she let them both be there because she had learned, in 8 years of sitting across tables from men who underestimated her, that the most dangerous moment is when the woman who has been underestimated finally stops being polite about it. She hadn't cried yet. She wasn't sure she was going to. What she was sure of, sitting there in the quiet, was that Kang Min-jae had spent 3 years planning how to remove her from his life. He had not spent a single day considering what she might do once she left it. That, she thought, was his first real mistake. Victoria Han's office was on the 14th floor of a building in Gangnam that had no sign out front, which Zora said was intentional. She doesn't need to advertise, Zora said in the elevator. Her clients find her by reputation, or by desperation, usually both. Amara had slept 3 hours. Not because she was crying, she still hadn't cried, which was starting to feel like its own problem, but because her mind had spent the night running inventory. 8 years of financial decisions, joint accounts, property holdings, the corporate structures Min-jae had built with her help, some of which she had personally designed the legitimacy frameworks for. She kept waking up with new items on the mental list and reaching for her phone to write them down until Zora took the phone away at 4 in the morning and told her to close her eyes. Victoria Han was 51 years old, small-framed, and wore reading glasses she didn't need for reading. Amara noticed she used them to look over, not through, when she wanted to make a point. She shook Amara's hand with the grip of someone who had decided a long time ago not to perform warmth she didn't feel. "Sit," she said. They sat. Victoria opened a legal pad and wrote the date at the top. Not a laptop, a legal pad, with a pen she clicked twice before she used it. "Tell me everything," she said. "Not the emotional version, the financial version. Start from the beginning." Amara had prepared for this. She talked for 40 minutes without stopping. The early years of the marriage, when Min-jae's organization was still predominantly underground, and she had been the one to argue, persistently, for a legitimate face. The branding work she'd done without formal compensation because they were married and it hadn't seemed like something that needed a contract. The international expansion strategy she'd developed and executed. The specific deals she'd personally negotiated in Singapore, Hong Kong, London. The names of executives she'd brought into the network. The investor relationships she'd built from cold introductions. Victoria wrote in shorthand and asked 3 questions the entire time. When Amara finished, Victoria put the pen down and looked at her over the reading glasses. "He's hidden money," she said. It wasn't a question. "I don't know that." "I do. The divorce papers came 4 months before you were served, which means he started preparation at least 6 months before that. Men like Kang Min-jae don't restructure their exit without restructuring their assets first." She tapped the legal pad. "How much do you know about the corporate structure of his holdings?" "Enough." "Specific enough to identify shell entities?" Amara thought about the long night she'd spent in Min-jae's home office reviewing documents, the names of the offshore entities she'd helped select for tax efficiency, the lieutenants whose personal names appeared on properties that were functionally company assets. "Yes," she said, "I know the structure. I helped design parts of it." Victoria looked at her for a moment with an expression that was the closest thing to appreciation Amara had seen from her. "Then we have somewhere to start." She closed the legal pad. "I'm going to bring in a forensic accountant, Park Seong-ho. He's the best in Seoul and he hates men who hide money more than he likes money himself, which makes him very motivated. We're going to pull every thread we can find in the 60-day window before your access closes." She paused. "This will not be comfortable. Min-jae will find out we're looking." "I know. He may apply pressure." "He applies pressure to everyone," Amara said. "He's been doing it since before I met him. I've watched him do it. I know what it looks like, and I know what he does when it doesn't work." Victoria studied her. "What does he do when it doesn't work?" "He escalates. Then he recalculates. He's not irrational. He's strategic. If he thinks the cost of escalating is higher than the cost of settling, he'll settle. We need to make the cost of fighting us genuinely high." "That's exactly what we're going to do." Victoria stood, extending her hand again. "I'll need a retainer by end of week. Zora has the figure." Amara stood and shook her hand. "One more thing," she said. "There's an affair. 3 years. His assistant, Su-yeon. He funded it. I don't know the specifics yet, but he would have used company accounts, or a structure adjacent to them. He's careful, but he's not careful about things he thinks no one is looking for." Victoria's mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile. Then let's give him something to be careful about. The first call came 4 days later. Amara was at Zora's kitchen table with her laptop and 3 weeks of downloaded bank statements when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She answered because she'd been answering everything since the filing. Creditors, journalists who'd somehow heard something, former colleagues checking in with the specific energy of people hoping for information. Ms. Brooks Kang. A man's voice, middle-aged, professionally neutral. My name is Attorney Choi. I represent Mr. Kang's interests in the current proceedings. I'm calling as a courtesy. That's generous, she said. A brief pause. Mr. Kang is concerned that the involvement of a forensic accounting firm suggests a direction in these proceedings that may be unnecessarily adversarial. He'd like to propose a meeting, informal, no counsel present, to discuss whether the current settlement terms might be restructured to address your concerns before this becomes more complicated. Amara looked at the bank statements in front of her. Park Seung-ho had found, in the first 48 hours, 4 offshore accounts that did not appear in any document provided with the divorce papers. 4. In 48 hours. Tell Mr. Kang I appreciate the courtesy, she said, but I have counsel, and all communications should go through her. Another pause. Ms. Brooks Kang, I want to be direct with you. Mr. Kang is prepared to be generous, but generosity has a window, and that window tends to close when proceedings become adversarial. I'd encourage you all... Attorney Choi, she kept her voice level. I said all communications through my attorney. Have a good afternoon. She hung up and texted Victoria. They called. Direct approach, informal meeting, no counsel. I declined. Victoria replied in 40 seconds. Good. Don't answer numbers you don't recognize from here on. Forward to me. The second call came through Zora. Amara was in the bathroom when she heard Zora's voice shift in the kitchen, that specific flattening that meant something was wrong. She came out to find Zora standing at the counter holding her phone against her chest, eyes doing a calculation. That was Ha-Yun, Zora said. Ha-Yun was a mutual friend, Korean American, had been in their social circle for 3 years. She's calling to let me know that there's a... She described it as a rumor, that you had an affair in Singapore, that it's why the marriage ended. Amara stood very still. She says it's going around the expat community, Zora continued. She wanted to warn me because she assumed it wasn't true. It's not true. I know it's not true. Zora set the phone down. He's managing the narrative. And there it was, the recalculation. He'd sent the attorney first, soft and generous. When that hadn't worked, he'd started building an alternate story. Amara the unfaithful wife. Amara the reason for the divorce. By the time the proceedings became public, if they became public, he'd have populated the social network with enough doubt that her account would be contested ground. She felt the anger arrive with a physical quality, settling into her chest like heat. Document it, she said. Everything Ha-Yun told you, date and time, and send it to Victoria. Already composing the message. That evening, Amara opened her laptop and started writing. Not to anyone in particular, just writing, the way she used to when she was 24 and figuring out what she wanted to do with her brain. She wrote everything she remembered about the early years of the company, the specific conversations where she'd proposed strategies Min-jae had later presented as his own in board meetings, the names of investors she'd courted personally, the brand language she'd written for the International Expansion Prospectus. She wrote for 3 hours, and when she stopped, she had 11 pages of single-space notes that were not, technically, a legal document, but which represented a detailed record of her contribution to an empire worth several billion won. She sent it to Victoria with the subject line, Memory document, use as needed. Victoria replied at midnight, This is extraordinary. I'll have Seung-ho cross-reference the dates with financial records. Don't delete anything. Min-jae's next move was more direct. She'd started taking meetings, quietly, professionally, feeling out whether her reputation in the international marketing world had survived being Kang Min-jae's wife for 8 years, or whether the association had absorbed her identity entirely. The first 3 meetings went well. People knew her work, even if they'd attributed it to proximity to his name. The fourth meeting, a preliminary conversation with a regional media firm that had expressed interest in her strategic consulting, ended with a polite email 2 hours later saying they'd decided to go a different direction. The fifth did the same. The sixth, she pushed back. Ask the contact, a woman she'd met at several summits and thought she'd built actual rapport with, to be honest with her. The contact took a day to respond. When she did, she said, I heard from someone in your husband's network. I was told there were questions about the IP on some of your past work, about whether the strategy you've been presenting as yours was actually developed by his internal teams. I'm sorry, Amara. I can't afford the exposure right now. She forwarded it to Victoria without comment. Victoria called her within 10 minutes. He's attacking your professional credibility, she said. Not with surprise, with a kind of focused grimness. He's telling people your work was his, which is spectacular, given that we have 11 pages of documentation suggesting the opposite and a forensic record that's going to back it up. He knows I need income, Amar said. He's cutting the options. Yes, which also means he's scared. Victoria paused. He wouldn't be doing this if he wasn't scared, Amara. Scared men are dangerous, but they're also readable. He's showing us exactly where he thinks you're vulnerable, so we go the opposite direction. What does that mean? It means we stop being quiet, Victoria said. Park Seung-ho filed his preliminary report this morning. 14 offshore accounts, 6 shell corporations, 3 luxury properties registered under the names of employees, and what appears to be a sustained pattern of marital fund transfers into accounts connected to Young Soo-yeon going back 31 months. A pause. He paid for her apartment, Amara. Her car. Multiple international trips. All of it came out of accounts that were, on paper, shared marital assets. The number 31 sat in Amara's chest like a stone. 31 months. 2 years and 7 months. She had been in Singapore negotiating his expansion deals while he was wiring marital money to his girlfriend's lease. File the countersuit, she said. I already drafted it. I need your sign-off. You have it. Once I file this, there is no version of this that ends quietly. He will come at you hard. Victoria. Amara's voice was very steady. File it. The countersuit landed in the courts on a Tuesday morning, and by Tuesday afternoon she knew Min Jae had read it, because Seo-jun, Min Jae's younger brother, who had always been the more emotional of the two, who had called her Nuna for 8 years with what she'd believed was genuine affection, showed up at Zora's apartment without calling. Zora opened the door, and Seo-jun was standing in the hallway in a jacket that looked like he'd put it on in a hurry, his hair not quite right, a look on his face that was somewhere between a plea and a threat. I need to talk to her, he said. She's not a... Zora started. Zora? His voice cracked on it, just slightly. Please. Amara appeared behind Zora. She'd heard his voice. She looked at him for a moment. This man she'd watched grow from 22 to 30, who'd eaten dinner at her table 100 times, who'd called her the first time a woman broke his heart. And she felt the grief move in a complicated direction. 5 minutes, she said. She didn't invite him inside. They stood in the hallway. You have to stop this, he said. I'm not going to stop this. Nuna, don't. The word came out harder than she intended. Don't call me that right now, Seo-jun. I can't. Not right now. He pulled back slightly, had the grace to look ashamed of the word. He's... The countersuit, the forensic accounts. This is going to destroy the company. Not just him. Everyone who works there. People who have nothing to do with... He should have thought about that when he spent marital assets on her apartment for 2.5 years. She watched his face. You knew, didn't you? Seo-jun looked at the floor. Seo-jun, look at me. He looked up. His eyes had the specific quality of a person holding something painful very carefully. Did you know? She said. I found out a year ago, he said. I told him to end it. I told him it was... I said it wasn't right. He said it was handled. Handled. She let the words sit there. I thought he meant he was going to end it with her. I didn't know about the papers. I swear to you, I didn't know about the papers until you... But you knew about her. For a year. And you had dinner at my table 3 times in that year, and you looked me in the eye and you didn't say anything. The silence that followed was its own kind of verdict. I'm sorry, he said, and it sounded genuine, which almost made it worse. Go home, Seojun. She stepped back toward Zora's door. And tell your brother, if he has something to say to me, he can say it in court. She closed the door. She stood in Zora's hallway for a moment, with her back against the door and her eyes on the ceiling, and she breathed through her mouth. Slow, deliberate, the way she'd learned to breathe in boardrooms when the numbers were bad and she couldn't afford to let it show. Zora appeared from the kitchen with a glass of water, said nothing, held it out. Amara took it. He's going to come himself next, Zora said. I know. He came on a Thursday. Not to Zora's apartment. He didn't know the address, or at least she'd believed he didn't until she walked out of the building on the way to Victoria's office, and he was standing beside a black car on the street below. Not threatening, or not openly, just standing, waiting. Dressed in a dark overcoat with his hands in his pockets and the flat face replaced with something she didn't have a clean word for. Not remorse, not quite, but something that had moved in that direction. She stopped on the pavement. He looked at her. She thought about walking past him. She was genuinely unsure, for a moment, whether she would. I want to talk, he said. Your attorney called. I referred him to mine. Not through attorneys, just 5 minutes, Amara. She looked at her watch. She had 40 minutes before she needed to be at Victoria's office, and she was going to stand here for 5 of them, because she wanted to look at him and feel what she felt clearly, without the buffer of legal documents and secondhand messages, because she was a person who needed to know what things actually were. Say what you came to say, she said. He came closer. Not touching distance, but closer. He looked tired, she noticed. Min-jae almost never looked tired. He'd always had a talent for projecting control so complete that exhaustion seemed like something that happened to other people. Today there were shadows under his eyes, and his jaw had a tightness that wasn't the management face. It was something more rawly physical, like a man who'd spent several nights with his teeth clenched. Good, said something cold and clear inside her. The countersuit, he said. The forensic accounts. This is going to go places that are bad for both of us, not just me. There are things in the financial structure that... He paused. If certain things come into court record, it creates exposure that goes beyond the divorce. Criminal exposure for people who aren't even part of this. You should have thought about the exposure when you structured your finances illegally, she said. Amara, I'm not doing this to hurt other people, Min-jae. I'm doing this because you spent 8 years building an empire on my work and then handed me an envelope. She kept her voice measured, and she was very deliberately not looking away from him because she wanted him to see that she was not afraid of him and she was not going to be managed. If the financial investigation creates legal exposure, that's the consequence of the financial decisions, not mine. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face. Frustration, maybe, or the specific grief of a man who understands, too late, the weight of what he's lost. I didn't want it to be like this, he said. I know you didn't. You wanted me to take the settlement and disappear. She picked up her bag. I don't disappear, Min-jae. You should have known that. You watched me for 11 years. She walked past him. He didn't follow her, didn't call her name, and she didn't look back. She walked to the end of the block and turned the corner and stood there for exactly 20 seconds, pressing her thumb against her own palm so hard it left a mark, breathing, just letting the body do its one essential job. And then she straightened her coat and kept walking. Victoria was at her desk when Amara arrived, already reading something on her computer with the focused grimness that seemed to be her natural resting state. He found me outside this morning, Amara said. On the street, in person. Victoria looked up. What did he say? He's worried about criminal exposure from the financial investigation. Victoria took her reading glasses off entirely and set them on the desk. He should be. She turned the laptop screen around. On it was a preliminary summary from Park Seung-ho. The full forensic report, 47 pages, with amounts and account numbers and dates and names and a transaction history that told a story so detailed and damning it had its own architecture. Seung-ho finished the full report this morning, 14 offshore accounts, 6 shell corporations. But there's more. She tapped the screen. 3 years ago, Min-jae began systematically undervaluing the legitimate business holdings in preparation for this divorce. Appraisals were manipulated. Corporate valuations were suppressed. The company that you built internationally is being represented in these divorce proceedings at roughly 30% of its actual market value. Amara looked at the number on the screen. He didn't just hide the money, Victoria continued. He restructured the entire legitimate enterprise to make it look smaller than it is. So when the court divides assets, you'd receive 30% of a number that was already manipulated to be a fraction of what it's actually worth. The room was very quiet. How much are we talking about? Amara said. Victoria told her the number. Amara sat down. She had known Min Jae was wealthy. She had known the company's international presence represented serious money. She had not, sitting in that room, across from the flat face and the manila envelope, understood the full architecture of what was being hidden from her, or how precisely and deliberately it had been constructed. He planned this for longer than 4 months, she said. Much longer, Victoria confirmed. The earliest restructuring transactions we've found are from 18 months ago. This wasn't a man who decided to divorce you and then protected his money. This was a man who decided to restructure his wealth and then arranged a divorce. The difference between those two sentences landed in Amara's chest with the specific weight of something permanent. File everything, she said. The forensic report, the manipulation evidence, the Soo-yeon transfers, all of it. The moment I file this, it becomes public record, Victoria said. His business partners will see it, his investors, his political connections. I know. He will not respond gently. Amara looked at the number on Victoria's screen, the real number, the one that represented what she had actually helped build, and she thought about the 11 pages of memory documentation and the 31 months of transfers to Soo-yeon's accounts, and Min Jae standing on the pavement outside looking tired for the first time in 11 years. File it, she said. Victoria held her gaze for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Park Seung-ho and said 4 words. Send me the final report. She hung up and looked back at Amara. Once this is filed, she said, Kang Min Jae will know there is no version of the next 6 months that doesn't cost him something enormous. He'll either settle at terms that are genuinely fair, or he'll fight. And if he fights, everything comes out. Every account, every transfer, every manipulation, everything. Amara nodded. You understand that everything means everything, Victoria said, including things that may be difficult to hear, about the money, about the company, about what he was doing while you were building his international presence. I already know the worst of it, Amara said. Victoria studied her. You think you do. Something in her tone made Amara go still. What else? She said. Victoria opened the forensic report to a page near the back and turned the laptop around again, pointing to a transaction block highlighted in yellow, and Amara leaned forward and read the date and the amount and the name of the account it had been transferred to, and she understood, in the space of about 4 seconds, that there was a category of things she had not yet known. The account belonged to a company she didn't recognize. The company was registered in the Cayman Islands 18 months ago. The registered director was Young Soo-yeon, and the amount, transferred in installments over the course of 14 months, was enough to capitalize a mid-sized company from scratch. Amara straightened up from the screen. He hadn't just been having an affair. He had been building her replacement. Not just a woman. A structure. A parallel professional entity, funded with marital money, designed to absorb the legitimate business functions that Amara currently performed, the international relationships, the brand strategy, the investor network, and transfer them to someone who would hold them under his complete control, without the inconvenience of a marriage license or 8 years of documented contribution. He had been replacing her in every sense, and he had used her own work, her own money, her own years to do it. Amara put her hand flat on Victoria's desk. Every account, she said. Her voice was very quiet. Every shell, every transaction, every document. I want it all in front of a judge. Victoria looked at her with the reading glasses off and the legal pad closed, and something in her expression that was, finally, unmistakably, respect. Then that, she said, is exactly what we're going to do. The filing went public on a Friday morning, which Victoria said was intentional. Weekends give the news cycle time to breathe, she said. By Monday, every financial journalist in Seoul will have read the summary. His investors will have had 2 days to talk to each other. Amara was at Zora's table when the court system uploaded the documents to the public record. She watched the timestamp change on her laptop screen, 9:04 a.m., and felt something settle in her chest that wasn't peace exactly, but was the specific quality of a decision that could not be undone. She had spent 8 years building things. She knew what it felt like to commit to a structure and watch it rise. This felt like the inverse, like committing to a demolition and hearing the first crack. Her phone started ringing at 9:11. She let it go to voicemail. Then again. Then a third time, a number she recognized as belonging to a financial journalist at the Korea Economic Daily who had covered Min Jae's expansion into Singapore 18 months ago, an article Amara had helped arrange, had spent 3 hours prepping the interview framework for, had essentially ghostwritten the talking points for while Min Jae sat across from the reporter performing visionary entrepreneur. She let it ring. Zora appeared with coffee and looked at the phone. How many? 4 in 7 minutes. It's working. It's starting, Amara said. By noon, she had 11 voicemails and a text from Seojun that said only, "What did you do?" She didn't respond to Seojun. She forwarded 3 of the journalist inquiries to Victoria, who responded, "Don't speak to press. Not yet. Let the documents speak first." The call she didn't expect came at 2:17 p.m. The number was unfamiliar, not Korean, a country code she had to look up, which turned out to be Singapore. She answered because Singapore meant the international network, meant the expansion partner she'd spent years cultivating. "Miss Brooks," a man's voice, measured English with a slight British accent. "My name is David Lim. I'm the regional director of Meridian Capital. We've met briefly at the Raffles Summit 2 years ago. You won't remember me." She did remember him. Quiet man, sharp eyes, had asked better questions than anyone else in the room during Min Jae's presentation. "I remember you," she said. A brief pause, as if that surprised him. "I'm calling because the filing this morning has created some significant concern among the investor consortium that backed the Seoul Singapore corridor expansion. We hold a substantial position in 3 of the entities named in the forensic report." Mar kept her voice neutral. "I see. We're trying to understand the scope of what we're looking at. The undervaluation allegation specifically." He paused again. "I want to be direct with you, Ms. Brooks. Several people in this consortium have believed for some time that you were the primary architect of the international strategy that made our investment viable. We invested because of the strategic framework. If the credit for that work is more complicated than it appeared, it is," she said. Silence. "The brand strategy, the investor relationship architecture, the expansion framework, I developed those. I can document the timeline and the process in detail." She paused. "Mr. Lim, I'm not trying to destabilize your investment. I'm trying to make sure the court has an accurate picture of what was built and who built it. Those are different goals. They may not remain different," he said carefully, "depending on how this proceeds." "I know." She looked at the wall of Zora's apartment, a print Zora had bought at a market in Cape Town, a woman walking with her back to the viewer, horizon ahead. "I'd be willing to speak with the consortium, not as part of the litigation, as the person who actually built what you invested in." Another pause, longer. "I'll convey that," he said. "Thank you, Ms. Brooks." He hung up. Amara put the phone down and sat with the specific feeling of a door opening that she had not been the one to push. Min Jae's response came that evening, not through his attorney, not through Seojun. He came himself, which she had not expected, not to Zora's apartment building, not in person, but there he was at 7:45 p.m., standing in the lobby when the building intercom buzzed. Zora answered, heard his voice, looked at Amara. "Your call, Bun," Zora said. Amara thought for exactly 4 seconds. "Tell him I'll come down." Zora's expression did several things in rapid succession. "Amara? I won't be long." She picked up her coat. The lobby of Zora's building was small. Mailboxes on one wall, a potted plant that had seen better years, fluorescent lighting that was unkind to everyone. Min Jae looked worse than he had on the pavement outside. 3 days of financial exposure, journalist inquiries, and investor panic had done something to the controlled surface. Not shattered it, he was too disciplined for that, but compressed it, tightened it until the effort of maintaining it was visible in the set of his jaw and the particular stillness of a man holding himself very carefully. He looked at her when she came through the lobby door. "You talked to Meridian," he said. "Meridian called me." "Don't play the distinction, Amara. You knew they'd call." "I knew the filing would create concern among the investors." "Yes." She stopped several feet from him, coat in her arms, not putting it on. She wasn't staying long enough to put her coat on. That's what happens when a court document reveals that the financial basis of their investment was misrepresented. It wasn't misrepresented. The valuation was suppressed by 70%, Minjae. That's not an accounting discrepancy. That's fraud. The word landed between them. He didn't flinch at it exactly, but something behind his eyes recalculated. "If Meridian pulls their position," he said, "the corridor expansion collapses. Not just for me. The Korean firms tied into that infrastructure, the subcontractors, the local partners, they go down too." "I know." "You know." His voice had an edge in it she hadn't heard before. Not anger. Something raw, something that was almost bewilderment. Like he genuinely hadn't predicted that she would know and not care. "And you're doing it anyway. You restructured 18 months of marital assets into a company owned by your girlfriend so you could replace me and hand me a fraction of what I earned," she said very quietly. "And you're surprised that I'm doing it anyway." His jaw tightened. The lobby hum of the fluorescent light filled the silence. "What do you want?" he said. "The court will determine what I get." "I'm asking what you want, right now, from me. What ends this?" She looked at him for a long moment. Looked at the man she had known for 11 years, the man who could walk into a room and make everyone in it aware of exactly where the power was, the man who had held her hand on a flight through turbulence and kept his voice perfectly steady so she wouldn't be afraid, the man who had spent 31 months wiring her money to another woman's life. "There's nothing you can offer me tonight," she said. "That conversation is over." She put her coat on, buttoned it, and walked past him to the lobby door. "Amara." She stopped, did not turn around. "I underestimated you," he said. "From the beginning. I've been doing it the whole time." A pause. "I thought I was protecting a strategic asset. I didn't understand I was looking at a person." She stood at the door with her hand on the bar. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me in 3 years," she said. She pushed through the door and walked out into the November dark. The twist came 11 days later, and it came from a direction she had not anticipated. Park Seung-ho called Victoria at 8 in the morning, and Victoria called Amara at 8:14, and Amara knew from the first syllable of Victoria's voice that something had changed in a way that was not straightforwardly good. "Come in," Victoria said. "Now." She was there by 9. Seung-ho was already in Victoria's office, a compact man in his 50s with a calculator's eyes and a habit of tapping his pen against his knee when he was processing. He was tapping it when Amara arrived. Victoria's legal pad was out, and she had written something and underlined it twice. "Sit down," Victoria said. Amara sat. Seung-ho opened a folder. "In the course of the extended forensic review," he said, with the specific flatness of a man who delivers bad news in professional language so the emotional content becomes the listener's problem to process, "we identified a set of transactions that fall outside the asset concealment pattern we've been documenting." "What kind of transactions?" Amara said. "Payments? Periodic. Originating from an account we initially flagged as one of Min Jae's shell entities, a holding company registered in Luxembourg." He set a page on Victoria's desk and turned it toward Amara. "The recipient account belongs to a woman named Choi Yoon-ji, Korean national, currently resident in Berlin." Amara looked at the page. "Who is she?" Seung-ho and Victoria exchanged the briefest glance. The glance of two people who have already had the harder part of this conversation without her. "She's the mother of Min Jae's son," Victoria said. "The child is 4 years old. The payments began approximately 5 months before the birth." The room did not change. The fluorescent light in Victoria's office continued its faint hum. The pen in Seung-ho's hand tapped once against his knee and then went still. Amara looked at the transaction page, then at the wall behind Victoria, then back at the page. A son, she said. Yes. He has during our marriage, he has a child. Born during the marriage, Victoria confirmed. The mother is not Jung Soo Yeon. She's a separate individual. From what we can determine, this was a separate relationship of shorter duration that resulted in a pregnancy. The payments are structured as child support, though they don't appear in any legal documentation. Off-book, consistent, and significant. Amara pressed her thumb against her palm, hard, the same gesture she'd used on the pavement outside Zora's building the day she'd walked past Min Jae. The same reflex for the same reason, something to put the shock into so it didn't go somewhere worse. How long have you known? She said. Since yesterday evening, Victoria said. I wanted to verify before bringing it to you. What does this do to the case? Victoria straightened in her chair. It complicates it. Specifically, Min Jae will argue, and he won't be wrong, that the child support payments, while undisclosed, represent a financial obligation that predates some of the asset concealment strategy. His attorneys will try to reframe part of the hidden asset structure as protective measures for the child, not fraudulent concealment from you. It gives them a sympathetic counter-narrative. A child, Amara said. The word had an unfamiliar texture. He has a 4-year-old son. Yes. He was with this woman, Choi Yun-ji, while he was with Soo-yeon, while he was married to me. The timelines suggest yes. She stood up. Not because she needed to go anywhere, but because sitting still had become suddenly impossible. Her body needed more space than a chair allowed, needed to move or break something, and she was not going to break something in Victoria Han's office. So she stood and walked to the window and looked out at Gangnam in the morning, the grid of buildings, the cold November light. She had built this city in her mind as hers. 8 years in Seoul. She'd walked every neighborhood, learned the transit system, navigated business culture in her second language, integrated herself into a world that was not originally hers because she had believed the person at the center of it was worth that cost. He had been maintaining 3 separate lives. Soo-yeon, Choi Yun-ji, her. 3 simultaneous structures. And the discipline required to maintain 3 simultaneous structures without any of them intersecting, the scheduling, the financial routing, the careful management of information, she knew because she had watched him operate for 11 years that he was capable of it. She had admired the organizational precision, had seen it as strength. She understood now it was a machine she had been inside of without knowing its full architecture. Does the child change what I'm entitled to? She said, without turning from the window. No, Victoria said firmly. The hidden assets, the fraudulent valuations, the marital fund transfers, those remain intact as claims. The child support obligation is separate and doesn't offset what he owes you, but, she paused. His attorneys are going to use the child in the courtroom, Amara. They're going to put a 4-year-old into the emotional geometry of this case, and judges are human beings. Amara turned from the window. Then we get ahead of it, she said. How? We acknowledge the child's existence before his attorneys can weaponize it. We make it clear that my claims have nothing to do with disrupting a child's financial security. We separate the issues cleanly so there's no surface area for the sympathy play. Seong-ho looked at Victoria. Victoria made a note. That's smart, she said. That's the right move. I know it's the right move. Amara picked up her bag. Send me the full documentation on the Luxembourg account. I want to see every transaction. She left Victoria's office and made it to the elevator before the shaking started. Not her hands this time. Something deeper, in the center of her chest. A tremor that wasn't grief or anger, but was some combination of the two that didn't have a clean name. She stood in the elevator with her arms crossed over her chest and her back against the wall, and she breathed through it, counting. The way she'd counted through turbulence, through bad board meetings, through the moment in the lobby of her own building when she'd first understood the life she'd been living was not the life she thought. She had thought the worst was the envelope. Then the 3 years. Then the 31 months of transfers. Then the Cayman Islands company. There was always another floor. She called Zora from the street. He has a kid, she said when Zora answered. A silence. What? 4 years old, different woman, Berlin. The silence from Zora was different from the kind of silence that meant she was processing. It was the kind that meant she was doing something physical to manage her reaction. Amara had known her long enough to identify the specific quality of a Zora silence that was covering fury. "Are you somewhere safe?" Zora finally said. "I'm on the street outside Victoria's building." "Come home." "I'm fine." "I didn't ask if you were fine. I said come home." Amara stood on the Gangnam pavement with taxis moving past, and the cold finding the gap between her coat collar and her jaw. And for the first time since the night she'd walked into her own bedroom and found another woman in her robe, she felt something in her eyes go hot. Not crying, not yet, just heat. The pressure of it. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said. She was there in 15, and Zora opened the door, and Amara walked in and sat on the couch and put her face in her hands and stayed there for a long time without making a sound, just feeling the full weight of what had been sitting on her chest since November, all of it at once, the way you feel a wound properly once the adrenaline stops. Zora sat beside her, didn't speak, didn't touch, just was there. After a while, Amara lifted her head. Her eyes were dry. "I need to work," she said. Zora looked at her. "Amara, no, I mean, I need to be doing something, building something. I cannot sit here and wait for the case to move. I need to be working." She looked at her hands, steady, both of them, when she spread them flat against her knees. "I've been so focused on the litigation that I've let him keep me in a defensive posture, responding to him, waiting for what he does next." She shook her head. "I need to stop responding and start building." "Building what?" "My own thing, not his. Not working for someone else's empire." She looked up. "I've been reaching out to firms because I needed income and credibility. But I have the income from the settlement access, at least through the 60 days, and I have more credibility than anyone's given me credit for because I actually did the work that they think came from Min Jae." She paused. "What I need is someone who already knows that, who already sees it." "The Singapore man," Zora said. "Meridian." Not Meridian, someone with a competing stake in the Korean market. She was thinking about something she'd held at the periphery of her mind for weeks, a name that had come up in several of the investor meetings she'd attended in Min Jae's orbit, always as the name on the other side of the table, always spoken with a particular combination of respect and competitive wariness. "Seo Ji-hoon," Zora raised an eyebrow. "The Seo Group. He's been trying to break into the international market for 3 years. His domestic operation is formidable, but his international brand strategy is inconsistent. They have the infrastructure, but not the language, not the investor relationship architecture." She looked at Zora. "I built exactly what he needs, from scratch, for a man who didn't deserve it." "You'd be going to his direct competitor." "I'd be going to the best alternative in the market." She picked up her phone. "Do you know anyone at Seo Group?" "My contact at the Chamber of Commerce knows his chief of staff." "Can you get me a meeting?" Zora studied her for a moment. The old studying look, the one that went back to college. That meant she was checking not just what Amara was asking, but whether Amara was actually ready for what the ask implied. "Yes," she said. The meeting with Seo Ji-hoon was supposed to be 30 minutes. It went for 2 hours and 40 minutes. And when Amara walked out of the Seo Group headquarters in Yeouido, she had the specific feeling of having been seen clearly by someone for the first time in a long time. Not romantically, not yet, nothing like that, but professionally, with the precise attention of a person who understood exactly what they were looking at and was not going to pretend otherwise. Ji-hoon was 44, lean, with the kind of attention that made you aware of it. Not oppressive, just complete. The attention of someone who had trained himself to receive information without filtering it through what he'd already decided. He'd listened to her first 20 minutes of presentation without interrupting once, which in Amara's experience of Korean boardrooms was rare enough to mean something. When she finished the framework outline, he'd said, "You built this for Kang." Yes, and it worked. The Singapore corridor expansion generated $400 million in new investor commitments in its first year. He'd looked at the documents she'd brought, not at her, at the documents, which she'd also respected, because it meant he was evaluating the work rather than performing evaluation of the person. "Why come to me?" he'd said. Because you have the infrastructure and the capital, and you're losing ground to his international presence despite being the stronger domestic operator. And I know exactly how his international presence was built because I built it, which means I know where the gaps are, what the vulnerabilities are, and what a competing strategy would need to look like. He'd looked up from the documents then. That's a significant advantage, he'd said. Yes. It's also ethically complicated. She'd held his gaze. I'm not proposing to use proprietary documents or protected information. I'm proposing to use my own expertise. Knowledge I developed through my own labor, even if it was in service of someone else's company. There's a distinction. He'd considered that for a moment. There is, he'd said. I want my legal team to confirm it. I'd expect nothing less. They talked for another hour and 40 minutes about the international landscape, the specific investor relationships that remained uncommitted to either camp, the brand positioning gaps in his current European outreach. She'd been careful, precise about what was hers to offer and what wasn't, which required a kind of ongoing internal calibration that was uncomfortable but necessary. Ji-hoon had noticed the precision. She'd seen him notice it. When she stood to leave, he'd stood too and offered his hand. I'll have my team follow up by end of week, he said. I'd like to explore a formal arrangement. I'd like that too, she said. She'd shaken his hand and walked out and stood in the lobby of the CO Group building with the cold precision of a woman who had just planted something in different soil, who had just made a move that was hers and no one else's. That was a Tuesday. On Thursday, Min Jae's legal team filed a counter motion. She heard about it from Victoria at noon, and the specific quality of Victoria's voice told her before the words did that this was not a procedural response, not a standard countermeasure. Victoria said, "Come in immediately," and Amara was there within the hour. The countermotion alleged that Amara had used protected proprietary information from the Kang Group's internal strategy documents in her meeting with Seo Ji-hoon. It alleged that the meeting constituted corporate espionage. It sought an injunction preventing Amara from engaging in any professional activity related to the Korean technology and investment sector for the duration of the divorce proceedings, and it requested that the court freeze her access to the settlement accounts pending investigation of the allegation. Amara read the motion twice. How did he know about the Ji-hoon meeting? She said. Victoria pressed her lips together. That's the question. The meeting was Tuesday. This was filed Thursday morning. He had someone watching me. Or someone inside the Seo Group. The implication settled. Amara thought about Ji-hoon's clean attention, his careful questions, his legal team's follow-up. She thought about the 48 hours between the meeting and the countermotion. Do you think Ji-hoon told him? She said. I think we need to find out, Victoria said, because if Ji-hoon is connected to Min Jae in ways that weren't disclosed, then I walked into a trap, Amara said. The room was very still. She thought about the 2 hours and 40 minutes in that office, the complete attention, the precise questions about the investor relationships she'd built, which ones remained uncommitted, which ones had known vulnerabilities, who the key contacts were at each firm. She thought about how freely she'd spoken because she'd been so certain she was finally talking to someone who was simply genuinely interested in her work. She thought about the countermotion filed 36 hours later. Her jaw tightened until she felt it in her temples. I need you to pull every public connection between Seo Ji-hoon and the Kang Group going back 5 years, she said. Business relationships, investment overlaps, social connections, everything. I'm already on it, Victoria said, and freeze everything on my end. No new meetings, no professional outreach, nothing until we know what we're dealing with. The injunction motion will go before a judge next week. If it's granted, I lose income access and professional mobility simultaneously while the litigation drags on. Amara said it flatly, the way you say something you need to hear in your own voice to make it real. He'd have me financially paralyzed and professionally locked out. Yes. Which means I couldn't sustain the litigation. Which may be the point, Victoria said. Amara looked at the counter-motion on the desk between them. She thought about the fluorescent lobby of Zora's building and Min Jae's tired face and the words he'd said, I underestimated you. From the beginning. She wondered if that had been true, or if it had been the first move in a longer game. Tell the opponent what she wants to hear, let her feel seen, let her feel like she's winning, and then file the motion that takes the board away. She wondered if the meeting with Ji-hoon had been engineered from the beginning, if his chief of staff, reachable through Zora's chamber contact, had been a door that looked like luck, but was actually a corridor Min-jae had built specifically for her to walk down. The thought arrived with a physical quality, cold and specific, somewhere behind her sternum. If that was true, then Min-jae hadn't just been responding to her moves. He had been ahead of them, and she had walked, with her forensic documents and her framework outline and her careful professional precision, directly into the place he'd prepared. She picked up the counter motion and held it in both hands and looked at it and felt, for the first time since the night with the envelope, something that was not anger and not grief, but was the specific cold clarity of a woman who understands that the war she thought she was winning has a second front she has not yet seen. She didn't sleep that night. Not insomnia exactly. More like her body had made a decision that sleep was a resource she couldn't afford, that every hour of dark and quiet needed to be working hours, because the clock on the injunction motion was already running and she had 6 days before a judge decided whether to lock her out of everything Min-jae needed her locked out of. She sat at Zora's kitchen table with the counter motion and a yellow legal pad, and she wrote, not notes, questions. The specific questions that needed answers before anything else could move. How did Min-jae know about the Ji-hoon meeting within 48 hours? Who was the connection between Ji-hoon's organization and the Kong group? Whether Zora's chamber contact, the one who'd facilitated the introduction, had any financial relationship with either entity. Whether Ji-hoon himself was a trap or a man who'd been used as one without knowing it, because those were different problems requiring different responses. At 2 a.m., she stopped writing and stared at the wall. The thing about Min-jae was that he never moved without understanding the full board. She had watched him operate for 11 years. She had sat in rooms while he made decisions that looked impulsive to everyone else in the room and were, she would understand weeks later, the precise conclusion of a calculation that had been running for months. He didn't react. He positioned, and then he waited for the other person to move into the space he'd already prepared. She picked up her pen and wrote one word in the center of a clean page. Ji-hoon. Then she sat and looked at it. If Ji-hoon was Min-jae's, the meeting had been constructed. The chief of staff accessible through Zora's contact, the 2 hours and 40 minutes of careful attention, the legal team follow-up, all of it a stage, and she'd delivered her strategy, her investor knowledge, her professional framework directly into Min-jae's intelligence network, while believing she was finally building something of her own. If Ji-hoon was not Min-jae's, if he was simply a man whose organization had a leak or whose staff had connections she didn't know about, then Ji-hoon was also a victim of Min-jae's surveillance, and potentially an ally who didn't yet know he needed to be one. The difference mattered enormously. She picked up her phone and called Victoria at 2:17 a.m. Victoria answered on the second ring, which told Amara that she also was not sleeping. I need to know which one it is, Amara said without preamble. Was Ji-hoon the trap, or was he used for it? I've had someone pulling the connection since we spoke. Give me until morning. I need it before morning. A pause. Why? Because if Ji-hoon didn't know he was being used, then I need to talk to him before his legal team decides how to respond to the countermotion. If he finds out about Min-jae's connection through his own attorneys, he'll distance himself from me to protect his company. I'll lose the only professional opening I have. Silence on the line. Then, I'll call you at 6. Victoria called at 5:48. His chief of staff, she said. Man named Park Dong-hyun. He went to university with Min-jae's younger brother. They've maintained a social relationship. Financial records show 3 dinners in the past 8 months, 2 of which occurred after you separated from Min-jae. So, Seojun, Amara said. It appears Seojun mentioned the Chamber of Commerce connection to Dong-hyun. Whether Dong-hyun told Ji-hoon or told Min-jae's network is still unclear, but the pipeline exists. Amara was already up and dressed. Ji-hoon may not have known. He may not have, but proving that requires him to cooperate, and right now his legal team is almost certainly telling him to stay away from anything connected to your litigation. Then I need to get to him before his legal team has that conversation. She looked at the clock. 5:51. Does he come into the office before 8? Amara, does he? A pause. His driver logs show he arrives between 7 and 7:15. Yawido headquarters. She was out of Zora's apartment by 6:20. The CO Group lobby at 7:04 a.m. was mostly empty. A security desk, a pair of early arriving staffers with coffee cups, recessed lighting that hadn't fully committed to the morning. She gave her name at the desk, said she was there to see Seo Ji-hoon, and watched the security guard perform the careful calculation of whether to call up or turn her away. She held his gaze and waited. He called up. She stood in the lobby for 4 minutes before Ji-hoon came out of the elevator himself. Not a staffer, not an assistant, him personally, which meant he'd decided to come down and see what was happening rather than send someone to manage it, which meant he was curious, which was the first useful thing she'd learned since 5:48 a.m. He looked at her the same way he'd looked at her documents in the meeting, directly, without performing anything. Ms. Brooks, he said. I need 5 minutes, she said. Not as a professional contact, as someone who may have been used against you without your knowledge. Something shifted in his expression. Not alarm, more like the specific attention of someone who has just received information that reorganizes other information. Come up, he said. They stood in his office, not sitting, both of them standing on opposite sides of the desk because this was not that kind of conversation. And she told him about Park Dong-hyun and Seo-jun and the 48-hour window between their meeting and the countermotion. She told him plainly and without editorializing, and she watched his face as she did. His face did very little, but his hands, which were on the back of his chair, went tight. Dong-hyun, he said. Your legal team will tell you to distance yourself from me, she said. I'm not here to ask you not to. I'm here to make sure you have the full picture before you decide. Because if Min-jae used your organization as a surveillance pipeline, that's information you need regardless of what happens with my litigation. Ji-hoon looked at her for a long moment. You came here at 7 in the morning, he said, because you needed to reach me before my attorneys did. Yes. That's either very calculated or very honest. It's both, she said. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. He let out a short breath. Not quite a laugh, more like the exhale of a man who has just adjusted to a new pressure reading. He came around the desk and pressed the intercom on his phone. Get me Park Dong-hyun, now. He looked back at Amara. Sit down, he said. This is going to take longer than 5 minutes. Dong-hyun was in the office by 7:40. A man in his late 30s with a round face and the specific pallor of someone who had been called to a meeting he already understood was bad. He looked at Amara and then at Ji-hoon, and something in his posture, a fractional collapse around the shoulders, told her everything before a word was said. Ji-hoon's voice was very quiet, that specific executive quiet that is more frightening than volume. Seo-jun Kang, he said, tell me about the last 8 months. Dong-hyun looked at the floor. Don't look at the floor. Look at me. He looked up. His eyes were doing the thing eyes do when a person is deciding between two kinds of honesty. We're friends, he said. We've been friends since school. He called me about 2 months ago. He said his brother was going through a difficult divorce and that there was a woman. He said she might approach the company and that if she did, he asked you to report to him, Ji-hoon said. He asked me to let him know. He said it was a family matter. He said there were business interests. Did you report on the meeting last Tuesday? A pause that was its own answer. Who did you tell? Ji-hoon said. Seo-jun, or the attorneys. Seo-jun, Dong-hyun said, almost a whisper. Pack your desk, Ji-hoon said. HR will contact you about severance. Dong-hyun looked up sharply. We're done, Ji-hoon said. The two words had a finality to them that didn't invite response. Dong-hyun left. The office was quiet. Ji-hoon looked at Amara. I need to speak with my legal team. I know, but I want to be direct with you before I do that. He moved to the window, the same unconscious movement she'd made in Victoria's office, The need to look at something external when the internal landscape was rearranging. What you built for Kang's international operation is visible in the market. Anyone who knows how to read an expansion trajectory can see a strategic intelligence behind it that his public-facing team doesn't have. I've been watching it for 2 years, he paused. When your name appeared in the litigation filings, I had my team pull everything publicly available on your professional history. Amara kept very still. I requested the meeting because I was already interested, he said. Donghyun's call from Seojun came after I requested it. He turned from the window. I want to make sure you have that full picture before you decide what to do with it. She held his gaze. Why are you telling me that? Because you came here at 7 in the morning to make sure I had mine. The injunction hearing was 6 days away. Victoria worked through the weekend with Seong-ho and 2 junior attorneys, building the response to the countermotion. The corporate espionage allegation required demonstrating that nothing Amara had shared with Ji-hoon's organization constituted protected proprietary information, that her knowledge of international strategy was hers, developed through her own labor, not derived from access to protected Kang Group documents. It was a defensible argument. It was also fine-edged enough that a judge inclined toward caution could rule either way. On Sunday evening, Ji-hoon's legal team submitted a voluntary declaration to the court. It confirmed that the meeting with Amara had been initiated by Ji-hoon's organization, outlined the information exchanged, and explicitly stated that no Kang Group proprietary documents or confidential materials had been provided or discussed. Victoria called Amara when it came through. He didn't have to do that, Victoria said. No, Amara said. He didn't. It significantly weakens the espionage allegation. It puts Min Jae's attorneys in the position of arguing that general strategic expertise is proprietary, which is a very hard argument to make. Is it enough? For the injunction hearing, it helps. But Min Jae is going to bring something else. He always does. Victoria paused. Prepare yourself for the hearing to be ugly. It was ugly. The courtroom was smaller than she'd imagined. All the legal proceedings she'd witnessed in her career had been corporate arbitration rooms, neutral and airless. This room had wood paneling and fluorescent bars and wooden benches in the back where she'd been told journalists were not permitted, but where 2 people sat with notebooks that were not press credentials but were not press credentials either. Min Jae sat at the opposite table with attorney Choi and 2 junior counsels, and he was wearing a charcoal suit that was so precisely correct for the setting that she understood he had given serious thought to what to wear in this room, which meant he had given serious thought to being perceived as reasonable and unfairly burdened, which meant he was already managing the judge the way he managed boardrooms. She looked at him once. He didn't look back, which was more unnerving than if he had. Attorney Choi opened with the espionage allegation, and it sounded, delivered in the courtroom's formal acoustic, more substantial than it had on paper. He used phrases like competitive intelligence extraction and systematic disclosure of protected strategic frameworks, and he said them with the confidence of a man who knows that complexity, introduced early enough, creates its own gravity. Victoria responded with Ji-hoon's declaration. Choi countered that a declaration from an interested party was self-serving. Victoria produced Seong-ho's analysis demonstrating that the strategies Amara had discussed fell within her documented personal professional expertise predating the marriage. Choi introduced 2 Kang Group executives who testified that the international frameworks were developed collaboratively with internal teams. Amara watched the executives testify. She knew both of them. One had been in the room when she'd presented the Singapore strategy, had taken notes, had asked 2 questions about the investor relationship architecture, had then presented his own version of her framework in a board meeting 8 days later with 3 slides and her language intact and his name on the title page. She wrote his name on Victoria's legal pad and slid it over. Victoria looked at it, made a note, and did not look at her. The judge recessed for 40 minutes. When he returned, his ruling on the injunction was measured and blunt in the way that judicial language is when a judge is declining to rule definitively but is making his leanings clear. Insufficient evidence to support the espionage allegation as currently structured, injunction denied on the professional activity restriction, but the account freeze issue to be revisited in 30 days pending additional documentation. Choi's face did not move. Min Jae's face did not move. Victoria touched Amar's arm briefly under the table. Outside the courtroom, in the hallway's hard afternoon light, Amara stood with Victoria and let out the breath she'd been holding since the judge sat back down. "Partial win," Victoria said. "What's the account exposure?" The freeze was denied for now. 30 days is manageable. Victoria looked at her. "He's going to try something else. This was his opening volley. The espionage angle was always thin. He was testing the judge's appetite and mapping our response." She paused. "You need to be ready for the main hearing in whatever form that test has prepared him for." She was ready 3 days later when Min Jae walked into her life one final time before the courtroom became unavoidable. She was outside, actually outside, on a bench in Yowido Park, because Zora had told her with some firmness that she needed air, that 4 walls and a laptop were metabolically insufficient for human survival. When she heard footsteps on the path and looked up, and there he was. No car, no attorney, no advance notice, just Min Jae in a dark coat, hands in his pockets, standing on the park path with his breath visible in the December cold. She looked at him. He sat down on the far end of the bench without asking, which was either audacious or desperate, and she was no longer sure she could tell the difference when it came to him. "I need this to stop," he said. "You keep saying that." "I mean it differently now." He looked at the river. The Han was gray and flat in December, moving slowly, the bridges strung with lights that were inadequate against the sky. Sung-ho's report is going to go before the full court. The offshore accounts, the Cayman structure, the Yunji payments. His jaw moved. When those go public, the criminal investigation isn't hypothetical anymore. There are people connected to my organization who will face consequences that have nothing to do with the divorce. You keep telling me that. Because it keeps being true. It was true when you built those structures, she said, not when I exposed them. He looked at her. The tired face again. Worse than it had been outside Zora's building, the shadows deeper, something in his eyes that she had not seen in 11 years of watching this man, and that she recognized, with a complicated grief, as something close to fear. "I have a son," he said. "I know. He's 4 years old. He has nothing to do with any of this." "I have never once moved to affect your son's financial security," she said. "My attorneys have been explicit about that. If you read the filings, I've read the filings. Then you know. I know what the filings say." He looked back at the river. "I don't know what you want. I've never known what you want when you're like this." "Like what?" "Certain," he said. "I never knew what to do with you when you were certain." The sentence landed with a strange weight. She sat with it for a moment. 11 years of marriage, and that was the word he chose. "You should have learned," she said, without heat. Just flatly. Just as a fact. "You had 11 years. I know. And instead you spent them making sure I was never certain about anything for long enough to be inconvenient." He didn't deny it. "Min Jae." She turned to look at him fully, which she had been avoiding. Up close, in the December gray, he looked like a man who had been very strong for a very long time and was running low on what that required. She was not glad of it in the way she would have expected. She was something more complicated. The grief and the fury, and beneath them both, distant but real, the 11 years. "I'm going to walk into that courtroom and tell the truth about what I built. Not to destroy you, because it's true, and it's mine. And I spent 8 years not saying it, and I'm done not saying it." His throat moved. "The consequences of the financial exposure are the consequences of the financial decisions," she continued. "You made them. I didn't." She stood up, picking up her bag. "If you want to protect your son's future, the smartest thing you can do is stop fighting the settlement and let the court reach terms that give both of us a clean ending. Because every day you fight, Seong-ho finds something else." She looked down at him on the bench. "There's always another floor," she said. "Isn't there?" She walked away from the bench, along the river path, into the gray December air, and she did not look back because she had learned, finally, at the full cost of the lesson, that the only productive direction was forward. The main hearing date arrived on a Tuesday in late January. Victoria had prepared for 6 weeks. Sung-ho's forensic team had documented everything. 47 pages expanded to 91. Every account, every shell, every transfer, every suppressed valuation with the corrected figure alongside it. Former executives had been deposed. 3 had provided testimony that directly attributed Amara's strategic work to herself, rather than to Min Jae's internal teams. One of them was the man she'd written on Victoria's legal pad, the one who'd presented her Singapore framework with his name on the title slide. And his deposition had cost him something visible. She could see it in the recording, could see him deciding that his own integrity was worth more than the Kang Group's version of events. She sat in the courtroom on the first morning of the main hearing and felt, in her chest, the convergence of everything. The November night with the envelope, the lobby, Zora's apartment, Victoria's office, and the yellow number on the laptop screen, and the Luxembourg account, and the 4-year-old in Berlin and the park bench, and Ji-hoon's declaration, and all of it, every piece, arriving simultaneously in this room, in this chair, at this table. Min Jae was at the opposite table again. This time he looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them looked away. Attorney Choi rose to give his opening statement, and Min Jae finally broke the look to turn forward, and Amara turned forward too, and Victoria's hand briefly touched her forearm. Not a comforting gesture, a signal, like a hand on a shoulder before a match. And then Victoria rose to begin her response, and the room shifted into the specific gravity of a proceeding that had been built over months, and now, finally, was going to move. The forensic accountant took the stand first. Sung-ho walked to the witness box with his folder and his pen and the complete absence of performance that made him, Amara had come to understand, extremely effective in rooms like this. He was not trying to be compelling, he was simply accurate. And accuracy in the context of 91 pages of documented financial fraud was its own form of devastating. Attorney Choi objected 12 times in the first 40 minutes. The judge sustained 4 of them. The other 8 landed in the record, and each one was a transaction, an account number, a date, an amount, building the architecture of what Min Jae had done the way you build a case against gravity. Not with drama, just with weight, accumulating until the room itself seemed to press differently. Then Victoria called her first executive witness. The man took the stand, mid-50s, former VP of International Development, who had left the Kang Group 8 months ago for reasons his resignation letter described as personal. And Victoria asked him about the Singapore expansion strategy, and he described it, and then Victoria asked him who had developed it, and he said, with the specific precision of a man who has decided to stop carrying something heavy, Ms. Brooks developed it. I was in the room when she presented the first framework. Min Jae didn't speak for the first 20 minutes because she was still presenting. Attorney Choi objected. The judge said, "Overruled. Continue." Victoria asked, "Was this typical?" The witness looked at his hands. "The international work, yes. She ran the strategy. He ran the relationships on the Korean side, the network, the political connections. She built what they needed to look like to the outside world." A pause. "We all knew it. It wasn't something you said." "Why not?" The witness looked at Min Jae's table, then back at Victoria. "Because it wasn't what he said," he said. "And in that organization, what Min Jae said was what was true." The room was very quiet. Victoria let the quiet sit for exactly the right amount of time. Then she said, "No further questions." And the day was not over. There were 2 more witnesses scheduled, and the forensic cross-examination still to come, and the Cayman Islands documents, and the Yunji payments, and the corrected valuations, but something had shifted in the room in that quiet. Something had settled, and Amara felt it in her chest like a door coming open that had been locked for a very long time. She looked straight ahead. Across the room, at the edge of her peripheral vision, she was aware of Min Jae's absolute stillness. Victoria leaned slightly toward her and said, just at the edge of audible, "Second witness in 20 minutes. You ready?" Amara breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, and felt her hands flat and steady on the table in front of her. The second witness was a woman named Baek Ji-won. Amara hadn't known her name until Victoria had mentioned it 2 weeks before the hearing, with the specific carefulness of someone delivering information they know will land hard. Ji-won was 41, had worked as a senior financial analyst inside the Kang Group for 6 years, had left 11 months ago, and had contacted Victoria's office 4 weeks into the litigation through a mutual legal contact with a message that said, in its entirety, "I have documentation. I've been waiting for someone to ask. She took the stand with the composed stillness of a person who has been afraid for a long time and has recently stopped being afraid, which is its own kind of dangerous precision. She wore a dark blazer and kept her hands flat on the railing of the witness box, and looked at Victoria when Victoria spoke to her, and at the judge when he addressed her, and at no one else. Attorney Choi objected to her qualification as a witness before she'd spoken a word. The judge overruled him. Victoria asked her to describe her role inside the Kang Group financial structure. She described it with the careful specificity of someone who had spent 11 months preparing exactly this description. The accounts she'd managed, the transaction authorizations she'd processed, the specific moment 3 years ago when she had been asked by a senior director acting on Min Jae's instruction to route a series of transfers through a Luxembourg holding account in a way that did not appear in the standard reconciliation reports. "Did you process those transfers?" Victoria asked. "Yes." "Why?" Ji-won looked at her hands briefly, then back up. "Because I needed my job. Because I had a mother who was sick and a lease that was expensive, and because when people like Min Jae tell people like me to do something, the consequence of not doing it is very clear even when it's never said out loud." She paused. "I've had 11 months to sit with that answer, and I don't have a better one." The room was extremely still. "What was the destination of those transfers?" Victoria asked. Ji-won named the Cayman Islands company. She named the date ranges. She named the authorization codes. She had printed copies of every document, personally retained outside the company system, in a folder that Victoria now entered into evidence with the careful efficiency of someone placing the final stones in an arch. Attorney Choi's cross-examination lasted 40 minutes and accomplished nothing that Amara could identify beyond demonstrating that Choi was a skilled attorney doing the best available work with an unavailable position. When Ji-won stepped down from the witness box, she did not look at Min Jae's table. She walked back to the gallery with her hands in her lap and sat down, and a woman beside her, older, probably her attorney, put a hand briefly on her arm, and Ji-won looked straight ahead. Amara watched her and thought about the 11 months, the waiting, the deciding. The hearing ran for 3 full days. On the afternoon of the second day, Attorney Choi asked for a recess, and the judge granted 30 minutes, and Amara sat at Victoria's table drinking water that she didn't taste while Victoria made notes, and Seong-ho reviewed documents, and the junior attorneys did the rapid-fire quiet communication of people managing a large and moving structure. Amara looked across the room. Min Jae was talking to Choi in a low voice, leaning forward slightly, and she could see from the angle of Choi's shoulders that whatever Min Jae was saying was not what Choi wanted to hear. Choi's hand made a brief gesture, the specific gesture of an attorney explaining risk to a client who is not fully receiving it. Min Jae's head moved slightly. She looked away. Zora was in the gallery, 3rd row, had been there all 3 days. She'd taken time off work. She'd said this plainly, without drama, simply, "I took the days. I'll be there." Amara had not asked her to, had not told her she needed her to. Zora had simply understood that there are moments in a person's life that should not be witnessed alone and had shown up accordingly, and every time Amara had glanced back during the harder testimony, she had found Zora's eyes already on her, steady and present, and not performing comfort, just being there. The 3rd day of testimony began with the corrected valuations. Seong-ho retook the stand and walked the court through the suppressed numbers, the actual market value of the legitimate business holdings versus the figures that appeared in Min Jae's divorce filing, with the methodology for each calculation explained in the patient detail of a man who understood that financial fraud is most devastating when it is made comprehensible to people who are not accountants. The judge asked 3 clarifying questions. Each one was precise. Each one told Amara that he had been reading the documents during the recesses. When Seong-ho was finished, the corrected numbers were in the record. The real value of what Amara had helped build was in the record. The gap between what she'd been offered in the manila envelope and what she was actually owed was in the record, and it was not a rounding error. It was not an accounting discrepancy. It was a deliberate and sustained effort to give her a fraction of what 11 years of her intelligence and labor had produced. The judge looked at the figure for a moment. Then he looked at Min Jae's table. Attorney Choi rose to begin his closing argument, and it was the performance of a very good attorney working in a burning building. Technically accomplished, structurally sound, genuinely impressive given the material, and ultimately insufficient. He argued that business valuations were inherently subjective, that marital contribution to corporate success was diffuse and difficult to isolate, that the financial structures in question reflected legitimate tax strategy rather than deliberate concealment. He was persuasive about some of it, and persuasive about none of what mattered. Victoria's closing was 12 minutes long. She used every minute of those 12 minutes to do one thing: restate what the document said, in plain language, in chronological order, without adjectives. She did not editorialize. She did not appeal to the court's sympathy. She simply put the architecture of the last 18 months in front of the judge, the way you put a structure in front of someone, and let them look at it and understand without being told what it is. When she sat down, the room had the quality of a held breath. The judge called a recess before ruling. He took 2 days. When he returned, his ruling was delivered in the measured judicial language that contained, if you knew how to read it, the full weight of what 3 days of testimony and 91 pages of forensic documentation had produced. The fraudulent valuation suppression was confirmed. The offshore accounts were confirmed as marital assets subject to division. The Cayman Islands structure was referred to the Financial Crimes Authority for criminal investigation, separately from the divorce proceedings, which the judge was careful to note, but referred nonetheless. The marital fund transfers to Young-Soo Yeon over 31 months were ruled as dissipation of marital assets and factored accordingly into the division. The settlement terms that Min Jae had placed in the manila envelope, the terms that represented a fraction of what the court had now established she was owed, were set aside entirely. Amara was awarded 63% of the confirmed marital estate. Ownership interests in 3 of the legitimate international business entities she had been instrumental in building. Financial compensation for the suppressed valuation differential. Full legal costs. The number, when Seong-ho calculated it for her in the hallway outside the courtroom while Victoria was still gathering documents, was large enough that she had to hear it twice. She nodded when she understood it. She didn't cry. She didn't make a sound. She pressed her thumb against her palm once, hard, and then released it. Min Jae was coming out of the courtroom with Choi when she turned from Seong-ho, and for a moment they were simply standing in the same hallway, 20 feet apart, the way 2 people stand after a storm has moved through the space between them and left the landscape altered past recognition. He looked at her. She looked at him. He looked not destroyed, not broken, nothing as dramatic as that. He looked like a man who has run a very sophisticated machine for a very long time and has finally encountered the one variable he failed to adequately account for, and the machine has stopped. He looked like a man standing in the wreckage of his own calculation. And what was strange, what she had not expected to feel, was that she did not feel triumphant looking at him. She felt tired. Deeply, honestly tired, in a way that had nothing to do with the 3 days in the courtroom and everything to do with the 11 years before them. He crossed the hallway. Choi moved to follow, and Min Jae put a hand out briefly, once, without looking back, and Choi stopped. He stopped 3 feet from her. In the fluorescent hallway light, he looked older than 46. The control was still there, and would probably always be there, was too deeply embedded to fully leave, but it was thinner than she had ever seen it, and underneath it was just a man who had made a series of choices that had compounded over years into a verdict. "I know what you want to say," she said quietly. "You don't have to." "I do," he said. She waited. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was reconsidering. Then, "Everything I built that matters, like the legitimacy, the international presence, the reputation that let me sit across from people who would never have touched me otherwise, but that was you. I've known that for a long time. I told myself it was collaborative, that the distinction didn't matter." He stopped. "It mattered." She held his gaze. "Yes," she said, "it did. I'm sorry." And she looked for the management in it, for the strategic calculation that was usually underneath his words. And she found, with a complicated exhaustion, that she didn't think it was there. Not this time. Not in this hallway with the case decided and nothing left to manage. Not for the proceedings, for the years, for what I did with what you gave me and what I didn't give you in return. She was quiet for a moment. I believe you, she said. That doesn't fix anything. I know. Your son is going to grow up, she said. The payments we arranged through the court, the Yunji support structure, that's clean now, legal. Whatever else happens with the criminal investigation, that's protected. I made sure of that. Something moved across his face. Quickly, controlled almost immediately. But she caught it. Something that was not gratitude exactly. Something rawer than that. Why? He said. Because he's 4 years old, she said. And 4-year-olds don't choose their fathers. She picked up her bag. Take care of yourself, Min-jae, she said. And it was not warmth, not forgiveness, not the reopening of anything. It was what it was. The honest wish of a woman who had loved a man for 11 years and was now putting that love down, finally and completely, in a courthouse hallway under fluorescent light. Genuinely. She walked to where Zora was waiting at the end of the hallway, and Zora looked at her face and didn't ask anything, just fell into step beside her, and they walked out of the building together into the January cold. Seoul in January had a specific quality of cold that was dry and total, the kind that found every gap and made no apologies for it. Amara stood on the courthouse steps for a moment and breathed it in, deep, and felt it fill her lungs and her chest and the spaces between things. Well, Zora said. Well, Amara said. Zora looped her arm through hers. Food, she said. Real food, not the soup you've been eating for 3 weeks. I like that soup. You've been eating grief soup for 3 weeks, and you know it. Zora steered her down the steps. I found a place in Itaewon. Black-owned, opens at 5, makes short ribs that will remind you that the world is survivable. Amara laughed. It came out rough and slightly unprepared, not the polished social laugh she'd spent years deploying in boardrooms, but an actual laugh, the kind that surprised her on the way out. And it felt like something unclenching in her chest that had been clenched so long she'd stopped noticing it. Short ribs, she said. Short ribs, Zora confirmed. And we are going to sit in that restaurant for as long as we want and not talk about anyone named Kang. The short ribs were exactly what Zora had promised. They sat in the restaurant for 3 hours and they did talk about Min-jae. Once, briefly, because some things need to be said out loud in ordinary settings before they can settle into the past. And then Zora talked about a man she'd been seeing for 2 months who made her laugh in a way she hadn't expected to laugh at 41. And Amara listened and asked questions and meant them. And by the time they paid the check, the courthouse felt like something that had happened in a different season, which it had. The weeks that followed were not triumphant in the way movies make triumph look. They were the weeks of actual logistics, of financial transfer confirmations, and property documentation and corporate structure filings, and the detailed administrative work of taking possession of a life that a court has said is yours. Victoria's office managed most of it, but Amara reviewed everything, which meant long evenings at a desk in the short-term apartment she'd leased in Mapogu. Not far from Zora, but her own space, with her own coffee maker and her own books stacked in a corner, and her clothes on hangers in a closet that smelled like someone else's fabric softener, and was slowly, gradually, beginning to smell like hers. The criminal investigation into Min-jae's financial structures moved on its own timeline, separate from her proceedings, and she followed it in the news with the detached attention of someone watching a storm through a window, aware of it, not inside it. In February, 2 of his senior directors were indicted on financial fraud charges. In March, 3 major investors withdrew from the Kang Group's upcoming development project, citing the ongoing investigation. In April, Min-jae stepped back from the day-to-day operations of his organization, voluntarily, his attorney announced, for personal reasons, and Seo-jun took an interim executive role that no one in the business community seemed to believe was temporary. She read the article about Seo-jun at her desk with a cup of coffee and thought about the young man who had stood in Zora's hallway saying Nuna and looking at the floor. She thought about what it cost to be the person who had to pick up what someone else's choices left behind. She didn't wish him badly. She found, when she looked for it, that she didn't wish any of them badly, not even Soo-yeon, who had disappeared from public view entirely after the divorce proceedings became news. No social media, no public statement, just an absence where a person had been, which was its own kind of cost. Choi Yun-ji she thought about differently. She had never met her. Had seen one photograph, court documentation, a woman with a careful face and a 4-year-old she was raising in Berlin with periodic payments from a court-mandated support structure. She had no feelings toward her that had a clean name. What she had was a complicated awareness that the web of Min Jae's life had contained people who were also, in their own ways, navigating the consequences of his architecture. Some who had chosen it, some who had simply found themselves inside it. The boy's name, she had learned from the court documents, was Kang Seo-an. She had looked at the name for a long time the night she'd first seen it. Then she had closed the document and not opened it again. Ji-hoon called in February, not through his legal team, not through intermediaries. His personal cell, a number she recognized from the business card he'd given her the morning she'd appeared in his lobby at 7 a.m. She answered because she'd decided weeks ago in a quiet moment that she was going to stop making decisions based on what felt safe and start making them based on what felt honest. "The legal situation is resolved," he said without preamble. "It is." "I'd like to resume the conversation we were having," he said. "About a formal arrangement, if you're still interested." She was quiet for a moment. "I have conditions this time," she said. "Real ones. Written. With actual compensation structure." "I expected that," he said. "My legal team has already drafted a framework. I'd like you to have your attorney review it before we meet." She sent it to Victoria that evening. Victoria returned her notes in 48 hours with 3 modifications and the comment, "This is a fair offer, better than fair. He wants you badly enough to negotiate honestly, which is rare." They met in his office again. Daytime, both teams present, no more 7 a.m. lobby appearances. He sat across the table from her, and she sat across from him, and there was the same quality of attention she'd noticed the first time. Complete, unhurried, genuinely evaluating. And this time she recognized it for what it was because she wasn't seeing it through the filter of desperation or the adrenaline of a case in motion. He was interested in her work. That was real. The rest, whatever the rest eventually became, was a separate conversation for a later time, and they both understood that without needing to say it, which was itself a kind of communication she hadn't experienced in a professional context in longer than she wanted to calculate. She signed the agreement in March. The announcement of her executive partnership at CO Group's international division generated exactly the coverage she'd expected, and a few things she hadn't. 2 journalists framed it as a move against Min Jae. She declined all interview requests through her communications contact and issued one written statement: "I'm here to do the work, that's all." The work was enormous, and she was good at it in a way that felt, now, like something she'd been given back rather than something she'd discovered. The Singapore relationships she'd built, the ones Meridian and a dozen other institutions had invested through, were still there, most of them, and they took her calls because they'd always been her calls, not Min Jae's. And the conversations resumed with the specific efficiency of professional relationships that had been waiting for their actual origin point to show up. David Lim from Meridian took a meeting in April, said, at the end of it, "We knew it was you. We hoped this would happen eventually." "You could have said so earlier," she told him. He looked slightly chastened. "Yes," he said. "We could have." She built the international framework for CO Group's expansion the way she built everything, from the inside out, starting with what was actually true about the organization, rather than what it wanted to project, working outward from structural reality toward market language. It took longer than the shortcut version would have. It was more durable than the shortcut version would have been. Ji-hoon let her work without interference, which turned out to be the thing she needed most from a professional partner, and had not received, she understood clearly now, for 8 years. In June, the Kang Group's political connections began publicly distancing themselves. The financial crimes investigation had widened, and 2 of the shell corporations were now under criminal asset freezes. Min Jae appeared in the news once, in a photograph outside a government building, looking like a man who had aged a decade in 6 months. Not broken, still upright, still wearing the right suit, but different in a way the camera caught clearly. The flat management face was still there, but whatever had been behind it that made people believe it had changed quality. She looked at the photograph for a moment. Then she closed the browser and went back to the proposal she was drafting for the Tokyo Investor Summit. September. The Tokyo Summit was the kind of event she'd attended for 6 years as Kang Min-jae's wife and strategic invisible hand. She'd sat in the second chair at those tables, managed the pre-meeting preparation, written the talking points her husband delivered while she watched from the room's edge. She'd been good at it. She'd told herself, in the years when she'd been honest with herself about the cost, that it was temporary, that her moment was coming, that the support role was building towards something, that the trajectory of her own ambitions was simply delayed rather than replaced. She walked into the Tokyo Summit as the Executive Vice President of International Strategy for CO Group. She sat in the first chair. The first hour was its own kind of reckoning. Not dramatic, not the way movies frame the moment of arrival, but internal and quiet and very specific. She sat at the table and she spoke, and the people across from her listened with the attention reserved for people who hold actual power. And she understood, in a cellular way she hadn't accessed through all the court victories and financial resolutions, that she had not simply recovered from what Min-jae had done to her. She had become more than what she'd been before him. Not because of him, not despite him. It was more complicated than either of those narratives. She had been extraordinary before him, and had made herself smaller in service of his vision, and what the last year had done, the full catastrophe of it, the envelope, and the attorneys, and the forensic accountants, and the courthouse, and the short ribs, and the lease, and the work, was not restore her to a previous state. It had compressed something in her that was now, under the new pressure, a different thing entirely. Harder, in some places. More honest about its own weight. She gave her presentation, and it landed the way she'd structured it to land, which meant cleanly and with precision, and when the questions came, she answered them with the specific confidence of a person who has built what they're describing. Ji-hoon was at the same summit. Their organizations were there together, which was new, which was visible, which generated exactly the kind of market attention two competing entities making strategic alignment generate. They had dinner the second night with 4 of the investors from the Singapore corridor, and she watched Ji-hoon across the table and noticed, not for the first time, that he did not try to own conversations she was in the middle of, that he did not redirect attention toward himself when she was receiving it, that when she said something he didn't already know, he went slightly still in the way that meant he was actually updating rather than performing interest. She noticed it the way you notice weather changing, not with drama, just with the quiet, accurate attention of a person whose instruments are finally well calibrated. After dinner, walking back through the hotel lobby, he said, "You were different tonight than you were in the March meetings." "Different how?" she said. "More comfortable," he said. "Not strategically comfortable. Actually comfortable." She thought about that. "I think I stopped auditing myself somewhere around the summit presentation," she said. "I've been doing it so long I didn't notice it until it stopped." Auditing yourself. Checking whether I was taking up too much space. Being too much, too certain. She paused. "It was a habit I developed, in a previous context." He was quiet for a moment. They were in the lobby with its polished surfaces and people moving around them, and the particular buzz of an international business summit at 9 p.m. "You're not too much," he said. Not performatively, just a straightforward statement of fact, the way he stated all facts. "I know," she said. And she did. She actually knew it now, not as a thing she told herself to function, but as something she'd earned through the full cost of the year. "I know." They stood in the lobby for a moment, and neither of them said anything else about it. That was its own kind of beginning. Not rushed, not declared, not converted into narrative while it was still just a feeling. The real things took time. She had learned that about the wrong things. She would not make the same error with the right ones. October brought the first criminal indictment against Min-jae personally. It was a single charge related to one of the offshore account structures, targeted, not comprehensive, the kind of initial charge that suggests a wider investigation finding its footing. She read the news report at her desk in the CO Group offices, which were now familiar enough to her that she knew where the light changed in the afternoon and which vending machine on the 4th floor gave you an extra few seconds to make a selection before defaulting. She sat with it for a while. The indictment. She did not feel vindicated. She felt, Again the word arrived, tired, in the deep, honest way, the way you feel when something has been moving for a very long time and has finally found its resting place. Whatever the investigation produced, whatever the legal outcome, it was now in a system designed for that purpose, and it was no longer hers to carry. She sent Victoria a text. Saw the news. Victoria replied, "It was always going to get here. You just moved it faster." She put the phone down and went back to the Tokyo expansion proposal, which was due to the investment committee by the end of the week. November. 1 year. She realized it at 7 in the morning on the specific date, standing in the kitchen of her apartment. Her apartment now, properly hers, the lease in her name, the coffee maker one she'd chosen, the cup on the counter a mug she'd bought at a market in Insadong on a Sunday when Zora had dragged her out into the autumn air. She was standing there with the mug and the coffee and the gray November light through the window, and she did the arithmetic and understood that exactly 1 year ago she had stepped off an elevator into a penthouse hallway with a bottle of Bollinger under her arm. She stood in her kitchen and thought about the woman who had stood in that hallway. She'd been good at so many things. She'd been so certain that loving someone completely was its own protection. She'd been doing the work of two people and calling it partnership. She'd been extraordinary in service of something that did not recognize her, and she'd accepted that arrangement because she hadn't yet understood the full cost of what she was accepting. That woman had walked out of a bedroom with a manila envelope and hadn't cried. Amara still hadn't, technically. Not the way she'd expected to. Not the grief breakdown she'd braced for in those early weeks. What had come instead was something more gradual, more distributed. A heaviness in a meeting that wasn't about the meeting, a moment in Zora's kitchen with her face in her hands and no sound. A conversation with Ji-hoon in a Tokyo hotel lobby where something she hadn't named lifted off her, and she felt the absence of its weight. That was grief, she'd learned. It didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it was just the very slow process of your body adjusting to the truth of what happened. She drank her coffee in the gray morning. Then she went to work. Ji-hoon called her that evening. He was in Busan for a meeting with local infrastructure partners and called from what sounded like an outdoor location. She could hear wind through the phone. "Are you on a roof?" she said. "Terrace," he said. "The meeting ran long, and I needed air." "How was it?" "Productive. Long." A pause. "Are you at the office?" "Home," she said. "For once." "Good." Another pause, longer. "I know what the date is," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't sure whether to mention it," he said. "Why did you?" she said. "Because I think it matters that someone acknowledges it," he said. "Not the case or the outcome. Just that a year ago something happened that cost you significantly, and you've spent the year building something real out of it, and that's worth someone saying it out loud." She sat on her couch in her apartment with the phone against her ear and the city outside her window, and Ji-hoon's voice coming through from a terrace in Busan, and she felt the complicated texture of the year in its full weight. Everything it had taken and everything it had returned, and the gap between those two things that would probably never be completely closed, only navigated, only lived with. "Thank you," she said, meaning it. "The Osaka meetings are next month," he said. "I was thinking we might go a day early, see the city properly." She considered this. "A day early," she said. "I've been told the food is worth the extra time." Ji-hoon. Yes. Is this a professional suggestion or a personal one? A pause. She could hear the wind through his phone, and she could almost see him. The still attention, the complete presence, the way he received information without performing anything. "Both," he said, "if that's all right." She looked at the city through her window, the lights coming on as dark arrived, the grid of Seoul spreading in every direction, the Han somewhere beyond the buildings, moving as it always moved, indifferent and continuous. "It's all right," she said. They talked for another hour, not about work, about his mother's insistence on feeding everyone who entered her home, about Amara's memories of Washington, D.C. summers, and the specific quality of heat that felt different from Seoul's heat, about a documentary on deep-sea fish they'd both apparently watched independently and had opinions about. Easy conversation, the kind that doesn't require management or performance or the constant low-level auditing of whether you are taking up too much space. She went to sleep that night without running through documents or legal timelines or next moves. She lay in the dark and felt the quiet of her apartment around her. Her apartment, her quiet, her dark. And she let herself be there in it without agenda. In the spring, she flew to Singapore for a 3-day investment summit. The Singapore corridor partners were there, the people she'd cultivated across years, who had invested in a vision she'd built in offices and hotel rooms and back channels while her name appeared on nothing. They knew now. The litigation had made it incontrovertibly clear, and the past year of her work at CO Group had confirmed it, and the way they received her in those meetings had the quality of a correction, not dramatic, not apologetic, just accurate. She was who she'd always been. The room finally matched. On the last evening of the summit, she walked along the waterfront alone while the sky went from orange to dark above Marina Bay, and she thought about the question she'd asked Min Jae in their last real conversation before the courtroom. Is it because you don't love me or because I don't fit? Both, he'd said, with that specific brutal gentleness. She understood now that the answer had told her something she needed, not about whether she was lovable or whether she fit. She understood both those things about herself with a clarity she no longer had to argue for. It had told her something about what the marriage had actually been, not a partnership where her absence would create a gap, a structure where her presence had been useful and her absence had been planned. You can love a structure. You can give years to it. Give your intelligence and your ambition and your careful, specific labor to it, and the structure can require all of that and return very little of it. And the fact that you loved it doesn't make the structure something it wasn't. She had loved him. That was true, and would probably remain true in the distant way that first serious things remain true. Not present, not active, but real, the way scar tissue is real. And it was also true that what she'd loved had not been what he actually was. She'd loved the version of him that she'd helped build, partially. The legitimate face, the international vision, the man who could sit across from investors and be taken seriously because she had spent years making him someone who could be taken seriously. She'd been, in some sense, in love with her own work. That was not a small thing to understand about yourself. She stood at the water's edge and let the warm Singapore air move around her. And she thought about the woman who had stood on a Seoul pavement in November with a champagne bottle and a shaking that wouldn't go to her hands and had called Zora because there was nowhere else to go. That woman had been afraid, underneath the steadiness. Afraid in a way she hadn't had language for. Not afraid of Min Jae, not afraid of being alone, but afraid that what had happened to her was somehow a verdict on her. That being discarded was a measurement. That the envelope on the bed was information about her worth rather than about his choices. She knew what it actually was now. Not because someone had told her, because she'd spent a year demonstrating it to herself, in the only way that actually produces knowledge, by doing the work, making the decisions, taking the losses, and finding out what she was made of under the full application of real pressure. What she was made of was considerable. She had always known that abstractly. Now she knew it in her body, in her hands, in the specific confidence of walking into a room and not checking herself before she entered it. She walked back from the waterfront through the warm Singapore night and went up to her hotel room and called Zora, who was in Seoul finishing a project deadline, and answered on the second ring sounding like someone who had consumed too much coffee and not enough dinner. "Tell me something good," Zora said. "Singapore is warm in February," Amar said. "That's the whole good thing. The summit went well. We closed the Meridian extension." "That's good." A pause. "You sound different." "Different how?" "I don't know." Settled. A pause. "Like you've put something down." Amara sat on the edge of the hotel bed with the Singapore city through the window and thought about that. "Yeah," she said. "I think I have." "Good," Zora said. "It was getting heavy to watch you carry it." They talked for 30 minutes. When she hung up, she sat in the quiet of the hotel room for a while. Then she opened her laptop and worked on the follow-up framework from the summit meetings, because the work was real and the work was hers, and that, she'd learned, was not a small thing. It was maybe the most important thing. The work that is genuinely yours, that comes from the actual place where your intelligence lives, rather than from the performance of someone else's vision, has a specific quality that you recognize when you finally return to it. It feels like your own handwriting after years of copying someone else's. She worked until midnight. Then she closed the laptop and slept. 2 years after the night with the envelope, Amara Brooks stood in a conference room on the 32nd floor of the CO Group headquarters building and watched the board of directors confirm her appointment as Global Chief Strategy Officer. The vote was unanimous. Ji-hoon, who had recused himself from the formal vote as a procedural matter, was standing at the back of the room, and when the vote was confirmed, she looked at him, and he gave her a look that was not triumphant and not performative. Just the honest look of a person who has watched someone do extraordinary work and is glad to have been in the room for it. The press coverage the next day included one article that framed her appointment as a sequel to the Kang divorce. She read the first paragraph and closed the browser. What she was had very little to do with what she'd come from. The story those journalists kept trying to write, the wife who survived, the woman who triumphed over the man who wronged her, was true in outline and missed entirely in texture. The real story was not about Min-jae. It had stopped being about him somewhere around the second month at Zora's apartment when she'd started writing the 11 pages of memory documentation and understood that what she was documenting was not evidence against him, but evidence of herself. That was the story, what she was, what she'd always been. The years of making it invisible and the year of making it undeniable, and the slow accumulation of days after that in which she simply, unglamorously, put it to use. In the spring of the following year, she and Ji-hoon went to Osaka for a long weekend. It was not a business trip. They walked through Dotonbori in the rain because he had read about a particular ramen place and insisted on finding it, and they found it 40 minutes later after taking 2 wrong turns. And they sat at a counter with 8 other people and ate in the specific companionable quiet of 2 people who have learned each other's rhythms. He ordered for both of them because he'd been to Osaka before and knew the menu. She didn't mind. She noticed that she didn't mind, which was information, because minding or not minding things in the context of another person was something she paid attention to now with the careful awareness of someone who has learned what it costs not to. He didn't manage her, didn't audit her, didn't make space for her in the way that actually, underneath, removed her agency, that performed generosity while maintaining the actual control. He simply treated her as what she was, which was an equal, which was someone whose intelligence and decisions he factored into his own without needing to domesticate them first. That was what she had not known she was looking for because she had not known, until recently, that it was something that actually existed outside of her expectations. Walking back from the ramen counter through the Osaka rain, umbrellas touching, she thought about the night of the envelope and the woman who had set a champagne bottle against a wall very carefully so it wouldn't break. She thought about Zora's couch and the shaking hands and the yellow legal pad and the number on Victoria's laptop screen and the hallway outside the courtroom and Min-jae's face at the park bench and Ji-won on the witness stand with her hands flat on the railing. She thought about all the floors. There is always another floor, she had told Min-jae. And it was true. It had been true of the investigation, of the revelations, of the compounding disclosures that had arrived one after another across those months. It was also true, she understood now, of the recovery. There was always another floor in that direction, too. Another level of herself she hadn't known was there until the pressure found it. She was not the woman who had walked into that penthouse hallway. She was also not that woman. The one hadn't replaced the other. The one had been changed by what happened into the other, through the specific alchemy of surviving something real, and the cost of that change was real and would not be sentimentalized, and the result of it was also real and would not be minimized. Ji-hoon said something about the rain. She laughed. In the morning, she sat at the window of the Osaka hotel with her coffee and looked at the wet city below and felt very simply like someone who was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because destiny had arranged it, and not because the universe had rewarded her suffering, but because she had made choices, one after another, difficult ones and costly ones, and occasionally deeply frightening ones, and the choices had accumulated into this morning, this window, this city, this life. It was hers, completely, unambiguously, hers. She drank her coffee. The city moved below her, indifferent and continuous, the way cities do, and she watched it with the steady attention of a woman who has learned to be present in her own life without apology And the rain fell on Osaka the way rain falls everywhere, without commentary, without verdict, without anything so neat as a lesson. Just rain, just a city, just the morning, just her, in it, alive.